Hey, everybody. This is Dan. Just popping in here at the start to let folks know that if the audio sounds a little different this week, it's because we were on the road. Ordinary Unhappiness was out and about in New York City. And because of that, we weren't able to record in our normal studio. So the audio is going to sound a little different. I hope that's okay. Rest assured, next week we will be back in the studio, so things should go back to normal. So without any further ado, let's get Uncanny together, shall we?
So Patrick and Dan went to the Met without me yesterday. And so I have to ask you, what was the single most uncanny piece of art that you saw?
I feel like the entire, what's her name, Cecily Brown exhibit, The Death and the Maid. She's a sort of, I guess, like modern abstract expressionist, these very large, heavily painted paintings. And they were really uncanny because there were two sort of things that were happening. One is that they were just, and I'd probably betray a certain philistinism here, but like they were kind of hard to look at for more than a couple seconds. Like it's just really kind of aggressively claustrophobic layering of paints in a sort of a color range that was lots of like pastels, etc. Right, so there was this like crowded pastels and pinks and greens and lime sort of like color stuff, so there was just like that, like looking at a painting that like you couldn't quite find where to land your eyes on. Like nothing was easy. I think Dan used the word abrasive, which I think was a deliberate choice on her part and very well put on his. But the second reason that they were like really uncanny is that part of what I take to be her art involves doing a lot of anamorphosis and sort of hidden images. So anamorphosis, right? Stuff you can only see from certain angles. And
I was going to ask you to define that, so thank you.
Yeah. So like it's stuff that's only visible, kind of like a magic eye thing, I guess. Like you look at it from one angle and you can see it, right? And a lot of her work is about working with these themes of like vanity and remembering that you're only mortal, right? The whole memento mori kind of thing. So you have these big fields of crowded colors, and sometimes you would see like, oh, this is a portrait of a woman sitting on a table. Or there was one that was very striking. There was these two girls talking to one another, and even as you could kind of process that it was two young women, it would then suddenly resolve itself into the shape of a giant skull. And then you would,
oh, that's cool.
You'd find your eyes moving again. Yeah, it felt, part of it felt like very like art critics art. Like a lot of it was like working through stuff that was referential to other paintings, but it was that combined feeling of being unable to figure out where you were supposed to look and like feeling your eyes failing to process, and then getting these flashes of just horror or like really estranged physical forms. It was a little bit Roger Bacon, but Francis Bacon rather, but even more so. And it was a hell of a thing.
Okay, so was it more or less uncanny than the kind of like AI generated art that Dan has been making, including some of what we've been using to promote Ordinary Unhappiness? Like full disclosure.
I think Dan's art is great. And I think it's like when the uncanniness is a deliberate effect and like it's the call is coming from inside the house, but you're the one making the house. I don't necessarily know if it's quite as uncanny, but I do wonder about like some of the other AI stuff that I've seen that has almost in some ways been more uncanny. I was thinking about those, and I wanted to ask you if you've seen like the AI video art that people are making of like ads for things like the Pizza Hut or like the family restaurant ads.
No, I have not seen this.
I mean, a lot of what we just said about Cecily Brown tracks to these things, right? You'll have a family of kids, and they'll be eating something that an AI has decided is like pizza. So it'll be round and have things on top of it. But the things are like nothing in the real world should be shaped like a cube that you would put, I guess maybe ham, but like a weird, like, or at least it shouldn't be like a cube that it resolves or decomposes itself into these like eldritch non-Euclidean angles.
Oh my God. You're giving me remember last week I was like, this isn't deja vu. This is an unbidden childhood memory that you're making come up for me, bubble up, as it were. Okay. My grandmother used to have this. This is like the very definition of a unitasker kitchen device. Its only purpose was to put a hard-boiled egg in it, and it would make the egg square.
That's horrifying, but cool too.
Yeah, but as a child, I loved these. They were stackable eggs. But yes, it took like the round and it forced it and like, organic and like all of this sort of like, I don't know. The egg is a pretty overdetermined object, right? But like, so what happens when you turn an egg into a cube? I don't know. It was a little horrifying. And yet I was obsessed with it. The yolk was turned pretty square.
So with the white and yellow parts were square?
Yes.
Wow. That feels like it's the other half of, it's like the obverse, and I actually can't do that. But like, it's like the occluded alternative to the those long eggs that you see in Scandinavia.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. The long egg. That's uncanny.
But it's not that uncanny when it's just a sliced egg. You're like, oh, this is a thing. You think it's just like looking at it from that angle, it seems fine. But then you actually see that it's a long tube, and
then you're looking for the long chicken also.
And which came first? Yeah.
So all of this is by way of saying that today is part 2 of our still only 2 parts in total, we promise, discussion of Freud's concept of the uncanny, and particularly what it has to do with the unconscious. You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today, the Uncanny Part 2, Revenge of the Uncanny. The Uncanny returns, Return of the... Okay, stop me, please. Somebody put me out of my misery.
The Revenge of the Repressed, I guess.
The Revenge of the Repressed, the Return of the Repressed, ghosts, revenants, all of those sorts of things. Patrick, will you do the very quick and dirty version of just a couple of the key things that we touched on last week, just to refresh everyone's recollection?
Yeah, totally. And the big thing I think we want to front right off the bat is that we're doing something a little bit untraditional in terms of sort of approaches into psychoanalysis by focusing on the uncanny as a kind of touchstone, as opposed to dreams, as opposed to slips of the tongue or whatever, right? But the idea here is that the uncanny is it names a feeling or names a phenomena that for our purposes we can kind of take as a real primo example of the unconscious is happening here. Right. Or that there is an unconscious and it's moving. Right. That it's uneasiness that is, it indexes the operation of this thing. Right.
Yeah.
So that's like the big thing.
That's a good way to put it. I mean, I think the other things I want to just remind everybody are the word is unheimlich, that idea of home-likeness, and then its opposite, the unhome-like. That's very much at work here. We're going to talk about homes. We're going to talk about families. All of these things are going to be very important as we are, again, kind of sneaking up on the unconscious, as Patrick said, not by the at least two traditional Freudian roots of dreams or parapraxis, otherwise known as Freudian slips, or I guess 3 symptoms, right? But by talking about the uncanny as this moment that is sort of like a pointer to the operations of the unconscious.
Yeah. Just to review real quick, right? The idea of the uncanny, or what the uncanny names, are a whole bunch of experiences that you can have occasionally in everyday life, and that are also sort of a playground of opportunities for representation in the arts, whether it be horror movies or Gothic novels or just weird stuff that we consume, hell, like AI doing commercials of Pizza Hut where people's faces are melting while they eat pizza that looks like it's made out of concrete, right? Which is an extreme example, but kind of gets to it, right? And so what the uncanny is this feeling of a sudden unbidden feeling of weirdness right? That just happens in the normal course of events or is provoked by a aesthetic or like anti-aesthetic art object, right? And the key feature of this moment of weirdness, which is a kind of uncertainty or a confusion, right? Reality, which normally has a kind of ordering, suddenly deforms. And a couple examples that Freud gives that are experiences that a lot of people report are ones of like deja vu. I've already lived this. I've already seen this, right? In this moment where suddenly something happens, you're like, oh, I've done this before, but or have I, right? Another one is the persistent weirdness or the obsession that people have, real or otherwise, and in fictions or otherwise, with the idea of like a double. You have another person out there. There's another person in the world who looks exactly like you or looks exactly like somebody else. You're walking through a crowd and then suddenly you see the face of someone that looks like, I don't know, your mother 20 years ago. And you're like, wait, what? And then they disappear. And you're left in this brief moment where you start asking questions like, did that actually happen? Or did I hallucinate it? Am I awake right now? Or am I dreaming? Right. And another example of this too, to think about like artistic representations, but also like objects that can be uncanny, are objects that refuse to settle into neat distinctions one way or another. So these are objects, classic examples include things like the marionette's doll, right? Or a puppet rather, or the creepy doll in the attic, but objects that suddenly trouble what would otherwise be familiar and reassuring and supposedly obvious distinctions between, say, something being alive and something being dead, right? Mm-hmm. Something being capable of moving on its own and being animate versus something being an object that does not move, right?
So if I'm hearing you correctly, you're getting at something like the coexistence of opposites within the same thing.
Yeah. And in a way that makes you kind of feel like a sort of existential vertigo or even like a nausea where you suddenly reel and you're like, oh, what you can't decide, you can't figure it out. And as a result, you don't know where you stand, mm-hmm. right? And it really strikes at your sense of like the logics that organize everyday other experiences and some of the most basic things you take for granted, right? Mm-hmm. And just to hit on, the classic examples again, right? Something is happening. Is this happening for the first time or has it happened before? Did it happen to me in a previous life or is this life that I'm living even real? Is that doppelganger the real me? But I thought I was me. So in other words, the distinctions that are collapsing are between past and present, inside, outside, self and other, living and death. Like these are things that we, they may be existential mysteries and they may be sort of stuff that, we could say a lot about as being complicated, but that we like to think are sort of separate until moments come along where suddenly you're like, wait, what exactly is going on? I thought that thing should move. I thought that was just a doll. I thought this is just me. And suddenly these things that were kind of like lodestars for an entire way of organizing your experience don't make sense.
It also sounds like you're talking about things that take you away from the ability to take refuge in reason.
Yeah. Yeah. You suddenly get the sense of like where suddenly you thought you were at home, knowing where things stand, who you are and where things are supposed to be.
Mm-hmm. Your place in the world.
Those things those logics are no longer lining up properly. And what used to be a source of normalcy and comfort suddenly becomes a site of profound anxiety and can make you feel like, you're not okay. And that maybe too, and this is where I think we can start thinking, we can invoke some of the ways in this like magical literature or thinking about the occult or like fantasy stuff may track. Mm-hmm. You suddenly have this sense that, actually, this object that's challenging me, this doll that I think may be alive or not, or this person in the mirror who doesn't look like me, but, I'm standing here. You start to wonder, what if there's a whole other hidden world going on? Something's being hidden from me, right? You've fallen into another order.
I mean, I think I want to pick up here and say, just to be, crystal clear, it's not that we aren't interested in the uncanny on its own terms. We are, but there's like bigger game afoot in another sense, which is to say, our first episode on the uncanny was primarily to introduce this concept, but the longer game has always been a kind of route into thinking in a couple of different, and we hope generative ways, about how to understand, which doesn't always mean how to conceptualize the unconscious. And so like that's endgame for us today. And we want to do it in this sort of variety of ways without just being like, we are turning to Freud's metapsychological essays. Here is the essay on the unconscious. We think it's going to be more circuitous. There's going to be a lot more threads to follow and eventually to pick up. But we think it's going to help to make our way into thinking about the unconscious through these like varied and circuitous routes. Because I mean, if there's one thing I have learned from Freud, it's like, you got to sneak up on shit like this. Like you absolutely do. You cannot simply, like, structurally, the unconscious is that which cannot be known to you as a conscious rational being at that particular moment. So we got to kind of go in search of it in a whole host of ways. And I know, Patrick, you in particular wanted to talk about the idea of the unconscious as a place, or I mean, a place isn't even right always, as like as a process or an entity, or whatever noun you want to throw at it here, where opposites coexist together.
Yeah, and I think it's one way to sort of both thematize what you were just saying, right, about like the difficulty of talking about the unconscious, right, in general, but as a theme in psychoanalysis specifically, is the fact that, well, like we like to think about, well, hell, when we think, we're generally thinking in a way that's conscious, right? And we like to think about ourselves as being, those famous rational animals, as Aristotle said, right? Like, so there is a way in which it goes against the grain to think about, well, to talk about and to think and talk about things that are not immediately accessible to thinking and talking about. Right?
Consciousness. Yes.
Yeah, consciousness. And so what I think we're trying to push for, and I will say that maybe it's worth saying here too, we're being a little repetitive, and I think we're being repetitive. But we
are being repetitive.
Yeah.
Are we doing it on purpose?
Yes. Well, I mean, this is the thing. Like, we're repeating something, but like in a way that's not like, we talked last week about like repetition that yields an uncanniness, where it's like you keep saying the same word over and over again, and suddenly you're like, oh, this is just a series of weird noises that I'm making with the organ that I also breathe and eat out of or via. And like, what are teeth and faces anyways? And this word just sounds like gibberish, right? So like you can kind of defamiliarize a word like that. Kind of paradoxically in psychoanalysis, the repetition of stuff can yield new insight, right? Sometimes you say things 1,000 times and then suddenly it hits different, it hits special because it's been built up. And I think when it comes to the uncanny, one thing that all these experiences that we're talking about describe, right, are moments of what you could call, well, defamiliarization of the familiar.
Yes.
The normal suddenly becomes abnormal.
Mm-hmm.
The very routine and everyday suddenly becomes, well, estranged, weird, and unfamiliar. You become alienated from it.
Mm-hmm.
And what that suggests, right, if we lean into those moments, if we just say, well, this isn't just a brain fart, right? This isn't just like me, like, this isn't just me like making a mistake, right? Or misrecognizing something.
Mm-hmm.
What it suggests is, and I think this is part of what the psychoanalytic enterprise in general kind of orients itself towards, is how much of what constitutes normal, what is normal, is actually kind of abnormal in general, or like involves it points to the amount of work that goes into the ongoing construction of normality and normal experience.
Yes.
Until suddenly, which becomes, and you don't really see it as work, right? The familiar is familiar because of repetition and because of your expectations. And then one moment when it becomes defamiliarized and you don't know where to stand, you realize that, well, that familiarity is an artifact of social convention, of routine, of habit, of a certain comfort that comes with expectations of normality, right? Of being what you get up and deal with. And so the moment when the familiar becomes defamiliarized, right, and the normal becomes abnormal, opens up the possibility of thinking about questions like, well, how do things become familiar? right? How do we make what's the ongoing work or the expectations of normality, and how does that shape what we see on a regular basis? So it sort of estranges us from the norm, or it attenuates the norm in a way that can be very productive.
So I'm going to suggest that we again. I'm the one that's like, we are on the track of this thing. This thing is the unconscious. We have to sneak up on it. This is the path that we're currently taking. We're thinking about it in particular as a site, the logic of which involves the coexistence of opposites, ambivalence, P and not P, all at once. And I wanted to invoke here a concept that I know is actually like near and dear to both Patrick's and my heart, in the sense that we both like to like invoke it lazily as a way to explain things without, it's become shorthand. And that is the term kettle logic, which is something that we get from the interpretation of dreams. We talked a little bit about the interpretation of dreams in the mailbag episode, but just to give you a sense of where this is, it is in pretty early on after the like enormous lit review at the beginning of the interpretation of dreams. And then we get the very famous analysis of a specimen dream, which is Freud's own dream, the dream of Irma's injection. We're not going to talk that much about it here, except to say that the central figure of the dream is a sort of composite figure of Irma, who is a patient, but is also like Freud's wife in that way where dreams condense multiple people into a single being. And that Freud himself, although he, is very clear that he could analyze this dream further and chooses not to, he does note that the wish fulfillment that the dream itself enacts is the desire to exculpate himself from creating harm in patients. I mean, I could, in this particular patient, et cetera, et cetera. We could go further, but we won't because we want to say something about kettle logic. Go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, and I think just to contextualize it in a way that maybe sound very basic, but like what Freud is describing here is how dreams have a logic of their own, yes, which is not the same as this is as logic as you may have learned it in like a logic class where propositions cancel each other out if one's a negative of the other.
Yes. So this is from the analysis of a specimen dream part of the interpretation of dreams. The whole plea, for the dream was nothing else, reminded one vividly of the defense put forward by the man who is charged by one of his neighbors with having given him back a borrowed kettle in a damaged condition. The defendant asserted first that he had given it back undamaged. Secondly, that the kettle had a hole in it when he borrowed it. And thirdly, that he had never borrowed a kettle from his neighbor at all. So much the better. If only a single one of these three lines of defense were to be accepted as valid, the man would have to be acquitted. Okay, so Patrick, you use kettle logic all the time. You use this
one way or another.
Tell us what you mean. No. I mean that you use the phrase. I don't mean that you're actually engaging in kettle logic, or did I mean that? I don't know. Right. When you're using it consciously as a term to refer to something, tell us what you mean by it.
Yes. So let's first we can start with close reading that example, right? Like here's a situation in which person A has lent person B their kettle. Like that empirically happened, right? Someone lent someone else a kettle, mm-hmm, and now person B is returning the kettle.
Okay. And so person A is the kettle lender.
Is the kettle lender, and B is the
kettle borrower.
The kettle borrower, and the kettle borrower is returning a kettle that has a bump in it, right? Like I lent you this kettle, says person A to person B, and God damn it, now it's been returned. You're giving it back to me, and it's got like a ding in it.
A hole. It has a hole.
It has a hole. Yes,
that's the whole thing. It doesn't work anymore.
Yeah.
If the kettle with a hole in it is worthless.
And the person B starts giving excuses, and those excuses are in and of themselves, any individual one is plausible, but they're all mutually contradictory, and they seem to imply like the coexistence of incompatible past narratives, right? Which are like, one, you never gave it to me in the first place. Two, you just broke it after I gave it back to you. Or three, it was broken to begin with when you gave it to me, right? And of course, these things are mutually contradictory and they don't make sense together. Or rather, they don't make sense together as a series of postulates, right? It can't be the case that someone both lent it to you and didn't lend it to you. It can't be the case that the thing was broken when they gave it to you, but also not broken so that you could use it, et cetera, right? But they do make sense together if we take the point of this example, or like what person B is saying and doing, as not being about immediate logical, like truth functionality, as I guess the logicians would say, but as having a functional sort of outcome and as resolving something by pushing it away or like working around it. Namely, what person B is doing is saying, this isn't my fucking problem anymore, right? I am not responsible for this kettle. Just take it, right? And the thing here to think about is that actually a lot of what passes for human reasoning or like human behavior is not in the realm of truth functional, like Turing tested propositions, but has like a functional outcome of being like, well, this isn't my problem, or like, this is the way I feel about something, and I'm going to give you multiple reasons for it, right? And a lot of those are about, you have to ask, well, what's the purpose of this? What's the function of this? And the function is generally stuff like, well, justifying how I feel, right? Pushing away blame, right? Telling stories that make me feel better, right? And it's worth thinking about some other examples here that kind of track, right? So some of them are more obvious than others. Like one is like, kids do kettle logic all the time, right? Someone breaks a toy, a kid breaks a toy, like, oh no, I didn't break it. It was my imaginary friend that broke it. And maybe it actually was broken when you gave it to me. And do you really care, right? This type of people, when they're fighting, when we regress, will sometimes feel like, I didn't do the dishes. No, wait, you did the dishes wrong, but also like, it doesn't even matter, right? The point here is not actually vindicating an argument, it's winning a fight, or like just like dominating someone, or not being. It's like, kind of think about it as like the way a squid shoots ink into the water to get away. It's just going to throw excuses until it can be done. Right?
I always think of it as throwing spaghetti at the wall.
You see what sticks. I mean, but it's worth saying here too that like this isn't just like people being like shitty lenders in the sharing economy, or people like dealing with like kids like not wanting to get out of chores. Right. This is also like, think about, say, like getting into a fight with someone, right? And these are really good examples. I think the best examples are ones where there's some slight pressure on us. We feel our emotions getting sort of more the better of us, right? Where we start saying things like, no, I know you are, but what am I? Right? Like, no, you're the one who's projecting. I'm not projecting. I never project. And if I am projecting, well, it's just because you made me, right? Where we start sort of kind of sputtering or offering mutually incompatible propositions, but where we understand the point of that is not being logical argumentation or arriving at like some sort of truth with a capital T, but about sort of maintaining a kind of emotional homeostasis where we don't have to think about ourselves as being the person who broke the kettle or the person who has to take responsibility for being a shitty friend, right? But like the point is like is that what we do when we communicate with one another, but also internally, is not so much about logical consistency. Right? Or that when push comes to shove, logical coherence is less important than preserving certain pretenses of our being reasonable people.
Yeah.
Right? So if, let's say we get into a fight and I'm screaming and I'm yelling things that are incompatible, and someone says, you're not being reasonable. And my response is, no, I'm the most reasonable person ever. This is just what happens when you make someone like me so angry. God damn it. It's your fault. Right? Where there's no sort of like, it's clearly not just about reason, or reason and rationality are not the only things that are happening here. And in fact,
they're just a very teeny sliver of what's at work.
And they go out the window when we're pressed. When someone you're loving, when someone who loves you comes at you and makes you feel defensive, you get aggressive, right? When someone who is someone you thought you knew behaves in a way that contradicts that, you get upset. Maybe you say things that you don't mean, right? But the key point here again is that rather than our just communicating to one another, or even communicating with ourselves and understanding ourselves as being simply about like truth or clarity or consistency, there's other stuff that happens. There's other stuff that's going on, and that stuff is about feelings. It's about attitudes that we may or may not want to acknowledge, right? Or that we may or may not even be, and here's the word again, conscious of. These are examples of situations where our unconscious motivations or our unconscious attitudes trump, so to speak, or have more salience than our conscious attitudes or our conscious beliefs.
I mean, if I'm hearing you correctly, Patrick, like one of this is not what you're saying explicitly, but it seems like part of what you are getting at here is aimed at persuading someone who is skeptical of, let's say, the Freudian idea of the unconscious, that it's a thing that exists at all. But I hear you in some ways as working towards an empirical claim. Is that right?
I think that, yeah, sure. I think like what I'm trying to get at is this idea that, and I think it's both counterintuitive and obvious, which makes it sort of hard to say, right? is that we are more than our stated commitments.
Yes.
Right? That our interactions with one another are more than what we might narrate them as if we were simply telling a story about a third person. Right? And that we have, so to speak, blind spots or spaces of where we are extremely contradictory, right? Or where perhaps a better way of saying this, maybe the tighter way of saying this is contradictions exist within ourselves, but we generally don't notice them as such. And we generally don't appreciate it when other people call attention to those things. In fact, we will oftentimes deny it and produce yet more contradictions or kind of torturously go around things, right? I mean, think about like, I don't know, and political examples are complicated, right? But think about like interviewing voters when they leave a ballot box. Like, why did you vote this way? Right? I should say, this is like, if you do read what people say when they vote, or why did you vote for whom you vote for? Like, their answers are always really wild, right? They don't necessarily, the average American is actually very contradictory about something, but one thing they rarely contradict themselves about, or they rarely own, is being like, well, I don't really have beliefs. I just like people more, right? Or be like, well, actually, I'm very unreasonable and I'm driven by hatred and my dislike of others. Or I'm a person who likes to feel superior, but actually is just acting based upon like a fairly narrow set of commitments determined by class and the current federal interest rate return or whatever, right? Like people don't like saying those things. Instead, we say stuff like, well, I weighed a variety of issues and I decided on what was more important for me. Right. Or I put these things in context and I decided that I'm a values voter. And that's why, in other words, we have these narratives that we tell that we not just don't tell one another, but that we tell ourselves about our motives, about our behaviors and basically the ways in which we all want to believe that we are good, reasonable, and clear, and that we know what we're doing. But what these encounters with the uncanny sort of suggest, and this is what, and what I think the unconscious more broadly points to, is how there is that those protestations, that commitment to the rational and the reasonable, that's just a tiny tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
Right? And that much more below us is another story, that there's something else going on, and that stuff contains a lot of contradictions or contains things that we would rather not think about. Yeah. And that we actively don't think about, but that may in fact really determine our behavior.
Yeah. I mean, and I think this is something Freud knew so well and put so well, about the ways in which the unconscious makes us uncomfortable, gives us, profound resistances, not only to psychoanalysis, at the level of individuals, but at the level of culture, right? Because the unconscious decenters the part of the self that is knowing. This is ridiculous, but do you remember a while ago on Twitter, there was the whole attack and dethrone God thing?
Yeah.
Every time I heard that, I always thought about this bit from Freud's essay, A Difficulty in Psychoanalysis. I know, this is a little bit of a deep cut. But it's the place where Freud famously says the ego is not master in its own house. But even before he does that, he gives us it's this 1917 essay. It's called The Difficulty in Psychoanalysis. Will you humor me?
Please, by all means, go for it.
To give you a little bit on this. So Freud says here, and it's a short essay. It's really known for that one line, the ego is not master in its own house. But he situates psychoanalysis, and he's talking about psychoanalysis, but in a lot of ways, I really think what he's talking about is the unconscious. He says science has delivered 3 like narcissistic wounds or blows to our self-love. He says to our self-love. And the first one, and you get a sense of how highly Freud thinks of himself in this essay also, because it's like it's going to be Copernicus, and then it's going to be Darwin, and then it's going to be Freud. So first, there's the Copernican revolution. We are no longer the center of the universe, like literally, right? And then Freud says there comes the second one, and this is with Darwin's discovery that we are not lords of creation. We are animals. And Freud doesn't like quote the Bible here, but I always feel like he's talking about we don't actually have like dominion over animals. It feels like he's thinking about Genesis. I don't know. Maybe that's just me reading in. But then the kicker here is the blow that Freud himself is dealing to, again, what he calls our self-love with psychoanalysis itself. And I wanted to read to you 2 passages. And the first is, this is like the vision of the mind, and specifically the ego, prior to this narcissistic wound that psychoanalysis inflicts on it. Okay? Post-Copernicus, post-Darwin. Although thus humbled in his external relations, man feels himself to be supreme within his own mind. Somewhere in the core of his ego, he has developed an organ of observation to keep a watch on his impulses and actions and see whether they harmonize with its demands. If they do not, they are ruthlessly inhibited and withdrawn. His internal perception, consciousness, gives the ego news of all the important occurrences in the mind's working, and the will, directed by these reports, carries out what the ego orders and modifies anything that seeks to accomplish itself spontaneously. And I love this coming sentence. For this mind is not a simple thing. On the contrary, it is a hierarchy of superordinated and subordinated agencies, a labyrinth of impulses striving independently of one another towards action, corresponding with a multiplicity of instincts and of relations with the external world, many of which are antagonistic to one another and incompatible. For proper functioning, it is necessary that the highest of these agencies should have knowledge of all that is going forward, and that its will should penetrate everywhere, so as to exert its influence. And in fact, the ego feels secure, both as to the completeness and trustworthiness of the reports it receives, and as to the openness of the channels through which it enforces its commands.
Maybe one way we can think about that kind of awesome quote is like, we like to think that we know why we do everything.
Mm-hmm.
Right. An example sometimes that we gave a couple episodes back, right, of like the person who is like, you got to meet my new girlfriend. She's totally different from the previous ones. And then you meet her and she's like, oh my God, this is actually the same thing. Or like kind of weird how all your partners look exactly like, one of your parents. Right. Like we give reasons for our behavior that oftentimes are post facto confabulations. Right. The reasons follow the decision to do something, or even like the decision to do something follows our already having done it. Right. So there's a way in which like our conscious narration of ourselves is not the same thing, or is just like a kind of spandrel or a trailing artifact of our having done things or been disposed to things for reasons that may not be what we would like to own, or that we may not even be aware of.
Yeah.
And so the idea there, as with sort of like a broader distinction between, and I think the invocations of Copernicus or Darwin are really good ones, is that when push comes to shove, for most people, right, is that we have an attachment. We have a literal investment in. We have an attachment to and an investment in certain fictions about ourselves and our own ability to account for our behavior and why we do things. Right. This is this idea. There's some ideas, some like the narcissistic blow, like the blow of being like, well, actually, no, I'm doing things not because I'm voting for Mitt Romney, not because he's going to help my bottom line, but because he looks like me. Right. Or
because I believe in putting dogs on cars.
Yeah, exactly. Like, or like I'm voting for these people because I really care about their tax policy. That's like what I'll tell you. But in reality, like what people don't say is, well, because I'm an unreasonable piece of shit and I just want to make other people angry before I die. Right. Like I'll take what I can get. Like people don't offer those reasons, but oftentimes those are the reasons why people do things.
Okay. So you're giving me a good segue to go back to this and give you the ego is not master in its own house bit. Okay. Yeah. So here's Freud again. These two discoveries, that the life of our sexual instincts cannot be wholly tamed, and that mental processes are in themselves unconscious and only reach the ego and come under its control through incomplete and untrustworthy perceptions. These two discoveries amount to a statement that the ego is not master in its own house. Together, they represent the third blow to man's self-love, what I may call the psychological one. No wonder, then, that the ego does not look favorably upon psychoanalysis and obstinately refuses to believe in it.
It's such a lovely line, right? Like, and particularly the invocation of the house may be kind of helpful for us with the uncanny kind of under our belt so far.
Yeah.
Right? Like, what could be more familiar to ourselves than us? Right? That's the claim here. I'm an expert in my own behavior. I know why I do things, and all my decisions are ones that I can narrate proudly and coherently. And even if I have regrets, I can articulate them in terms of a story that like spins them into something where I was the driver of my own decisions. But Freud seems to suggest, what if I'm not the driver of my own decisions? Or what if, like, yes, I make my own decisions, there is such a thing as reason, etc. But what if that's not the whole story? Right? What if there are other things that exceed my my control or even my consciousness that play a role in shaping how I behave or how I relate to myself? And
they are me.
Thing.
And those things are me.
Yeah, they're part of me. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the distinction. So one way we can think about this, right, is that and I'm using the uncanny here as a metaphor, but also as like, again, the uncanny offers a paradigm for thinking about how the unconscious behaves, but also how we react to the unconscious when its activity is exposed to us. Yeah. Right. I think that's sort of the key takeaway here, right? Is that the unconscious, or like encountering the unconscious, troubles our distinction between the rational and the irrational.
Yes.
Like the reasonable and the unreasonable, the known and the unknown.
Yes.
And I think that the broader psychoanalytic insight here is that this thing that we call the human person and those people that we call ourselves represent both those things, straddle those distinctions, right? And in sometimes even like some of the most important things in our life, right? From like, like stuff we do in bed to people we vote for to ways we even understand our destiny as from being children onwards, like what our roles are handed to us and even embraced by us or rejected by us for reasons that aren't just conscious.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think this is one of the reasons, and I promise this is the last text that I'm going to make us deal with today. Or is it? No, it is. It is. This is why Paul Ricoeur, who wrote Freud and Philosophy, like famously calls Freud one of the masters of suspicion, along with Marx and Nietzsche. And I wanted to pair the little snippet from Freud about how the ego is not master in its own house with a little bit of Ricoeur in a way that I think helps do a couple of things. One, and maybe only I care about this, so sorry, but also not sorry, like helps situate Freud in a certain philosophical lineage in terms of like the meaning and implications of the unconscious. And it also helps us see Freud as a cultural critic and the concept of the unconscious as an indispensable tool for not only like literary criticism in the way that he gives us that in the Uncanny essay, but really opening into like the field of culture. So here's something I wanted to read. So this is Paul Ricoeur. Three masters, seemingly, master is apparently one of the themes here. Okay. Three masters, or unmasterability, the inability to master things, whatever. Three masters, seemingly mutually exclusive, dominate the school of suspicion: Marx, Nietzsche, Freud. If we go back to the intention they had in common, we find in it the decision to look upon the whole of consciousness primarily as false consciousness. They thereby take up again, each in a different manner, the problem of the Cartesian doubt, to carry it to the very heart of the Cartesian stronghold. The philosopher trained in the school of Descartes knows that things are doubtful, that they are not such as they appear, but he does not doubt that consciousness is such as it appears to itself. In consciousness, meaning and consciousness of meaning coincide. Since Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, this too has become doubtful. After the doubt about things, we have started to doubt consciousness. All three clear the horizon for a more authentic word, for a new reign of truth, not only by means of a destructive critique, but by the invention of an art of interpreting. Descartes triumphed over the doubt as to things by the evidence of consciousness. They triumph over the doubt as to consciousness by an exegesis of meaning. Beginning with them, understanding is hermeneutics. Henceforward, to seek meaning is no longer to spell out the consciousness of meaning, but to decipher its expressions. Isn't that good?
That's really good.
Yeah.
I think one thing we can do here, right, is like just to take a second and unpack, like what's the narratives that these masters have, what are the narratives, or we could even call them like meta narratives, like really big narratives, to use a kind of time-worn frames, right?
I feel like really big narratives is not how you want to gloss meta narratives.
I would want to lean in because Ricoeur's French would be grand récit, right? It would be big narratives, grand narratives, right? That each one of these masters of suspicion undoes.
Yes.
Right. So Copernicus, or I guess Galileo possibly, but like the idea here is that like they undo heliocentrism. Right? We have an investment with the way we understand the entire world, right? To the point that literally what's normal is perceived in terms of a self-evidence that is not warranted by the evidence, right?
Yes.
I.e., like we have to do some work to map to actually warp the figures in terms of how we are processing like the way the sun casts shadows and the way like days are organized to make these arguments. But we are really invested in the idea that we are the literal center of the universe, right? And then Copernicus and Galileo come along, and according to this narrative, though of course many people didn't believe the Earth was round, but whatever. The point here is that they like in this narrative, which is itself a narrative, like they unseat that. No, we are not the center of the universe. In fact, we are revolving around this sun, and that's enough for some people to get burned at the stake. That is an affront, right? Making this claim. Our places of primacy.
The narcissistic wound.
Yeah, the narcissistic wound is enough that we actually wound people.
Yeah.
Right. Darwin. Right? This idea that the human being is an unchanging creature, right? Produced in the likeness of God himself with a capital H, right? And then the Darwinian intervention being, well, no, actually, we are just the output, right, of a competitive struggle among organisms, but also of an organism to adapt to its changing environment. And in fact, our relatives are not, our closest relative may not in fact be the God in whose mimetic image we were designed, but a bunch of hooting and hollering creatures that are, throwing shit at us from trees, right? That's a narcissistic wound. So people will burn Darwin, right? These are great grand narratives in the French sense, or like meta narratives in our sense. Like these are big stories, and they're ones that flatter us and put us at the center of things. And they say what we see is what we get, to the point to which, like, whether it be the Scopes trial or the witch burnings, or like the burning of all these various, like Giordano Bruno or whoever, right? These heretics who like dispute heliocentrism or whatever, like they are arguing here, being Copernicus, Galileo, Darwin, etc., against what's obvious. It's obvious that we're not related to these creatures, right? It's obvious that we're the center of the world. It's obvious that we're created in God's image, right? There is an ongoing investment in these things that flatter us, And Freud, right? And Marx too. We could put this in this genealogy or in this succession, right? Like,
sure.
Marx like, no, you are not making decisions politically because of your desire, because of your like discursive discussion of like what is as the outcome of like your better discussions of like trying to achieve the good. But no, because you're like the base determines the superstructure. Your political preferences are a function of your financial interests or because of your material class of solidarity.
Yeah.
Right. So like the rational market is kind of your commitments even to the rationality of the market are the guardrails to that are the contingent irrationality, randomness of birth, and your commitment to that. Right. So that's another thing that kind of wounds us. It takes us out of this. We become the output of economic forces rather than being drivers of our own destiny. Right. Nietzsche too does another one. Right. Like the idea is here. Well, no, this story of Christianity, if we take Nietzsche's argument of this, right, is not the revealed wisdom, but is in fact the kind of warped output of a series of historical processes involving the overthrow of paganism and the assertion of this, for Nietzsche, this kind of perverse Christian order.
Right. And also, P.S., truth is perspectival entirely.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's a whole bunch of coins that we exchange to the point which like the size of the coins have become like worn off in his famous metaphor, right? They're tokenistic things. Now, Freud comes along in all this, right? And Freud is responding to what we could call a certain type of psychological positivism or to a certain type of vision of the person as being a fully rational person, a very rational being who can account for all their actions in self-present terms. And again, which seems obvious, but also Freud calls attention to things that are kind of even more obvious, namely that we do stuff like dream and have weird things hallucinate in our mind in our mind's eye when we do this. Or to go back to the uncanny, right, that we are haunted by sudden feelings of weirdness and we don't know where they come from, or at least we don't seem to know where they come from.
I've always really liked the way that Ricoeur formulates this, that Freud takes, I mean, Freud, Marx and Nietzsche, but Freud just for our purposes right now, taking the problem of Cartesian doubt and carrying it to the heart of the Cartesian stronghold, I think is so wonderful. Because Descartes has a project of radical doubt, but it's like once he's done, systematically doubting everything, he builds it all back up, right? It's in service of creating. He doesn't mean for us to hover in existential uncertainty forever. In fact, he gets us back pretty quickly, right? And it is the self, that is the locus of that certainty and on which we can build everything else. So I guess I envision like a sort of a turning inwards there of like the Cartesian doubt, which is because the Cartesian doubt is always faced outwards. It's doubting of the senses, the narrative, of the evidence of the senses, like, am I dreaming, et cetera, et cetera. But to actually deliver that doubt to the locus of selfhood, that's powerful. And again, I go with this language of a profound narcissistic wound. It's if I could just to elaborate on that, like it's kind of wild, right? In some ways, right? Insofar as that, like the Cartesian, there are a series of moves. We could get into the discourse method if we wanted to, right? But like there are like a series of moves that Descartes makes where he basically everyone would stop listening to us if we didn't. Yeah, we're stop listening. Sorry, we won't do that. No. But like, like there are a couple things that even in his exercise that you're saying of radical doubt, right? Yeah. I'm going to put every one of my sense percepts to test. Yeah. Right. Descartes has to say at the get-go, but then also at the ending, right? That there's certain things that can't be questioned. Right. So I can't famously, right? God, yeah. And also God is not a demon deceiving us, right? Literally. So the idea that our sense perceptions could on some level be fundamentally warped, we can only that would be the work of a demon. He literally it's the demiurgical thing. Right? No, it's not like he's saying like the Freudian thing is like, well, actually, what if the way we perceive our senses perceptions may be filtered through, what if we're the demon? What if we do a little bit of self-deception? What if we're invested in self-deception? Like that's that's a perversely satanic thing from a Cartesian perspective, right? But also like the solidity of the Cartesian. I like it. That was kind of nice. Thank you. You're welcome. But like this idea, like, I think, therefore I am. Right. This idea that here's the thing, which, well, I am thinking, therefore I am. It goes away when you stop thinking. Yeah. Well, I am thinking I'm cogito, a first person, ergo sum. I am the first person, me. Right. And I was doing the French version, but okay. Yeah. Yeah. Hell,
like in his Latin and in his French, right?
Yeah.
In both cases, it's marked in the first person, right? It's me doing thinking, it's my thinking, and therefore it's me who is.
Yeah.
Right?
I meant the
It,
present participle.
Right? Yeah. But whereas, the Freudian account is again, this is the thing. Well, what if the you doing the thinking and the you who is doing the being, what if we can't so evenly map those pronouns onto one another? Because the thinking in question isn't all the stuff that is you, or there's thinking that's going on that's unconscious, right? And so again, we can lean into the uncanny here, where it's like the moment where suddenly you're doing the Cartesian thing and you're playing with a little ball of wax, or you're being like, okay, I'm going to radically peel away all other possible things that could skew my perception. And then suddenly like, oh, wow, actually I have this, again, so to speak, blind spot at the center of my perception, right? And that blind spot is because of me, right? Or there's stuff I'd rather not see about myself, or I don't even know me, right? So then you feel vertiginously lost. Right. So what to close out this idea of like Freud as it being in this tradition, right? Freud is calling attention to how, contra someone whose basic beginning and end, and then the generative, like both the keystone and the foundation of their entire thing, right? Of the mansion of reason that they beautifully build, right, is self-presence and rationality. The Freudian response is, well, what if, you're not master in the house? And what if like that's a haunted house? And the thing that's haunting the house is you and other people, and they're part of you, and you're not entirely the same person all at the same time.
Yes.
Right? It's a profoundly disturbing thing. Of course you'd feel nauseous about it. It makes you uncanny. The I becomes very uncanny.
That you want to talk about families today, and maybe the things that make families uncanny, family secrets, intergenerational trauma, family mythologies, the stories that families tell themselves, all of them, of course, with their own kind of holes, and also the ways that those stories take effort to build and maintain.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I think and here's the first thing to say, right? And this is, I think, a part of thinking psychoanalytically, but also very much close to the way Freud thinks. And I think it can be helpful, is that Freud is very much into thinking by things of analogy, right? So a lot of what we're saying about like the individual has investments in their being reasonable and knowing what's going on at all times applies to, say, how the family might think about itself, or how we like to think about our families, or how socially, like collectively, politically, or otherwise, we like to think about families, or we like to think about what individuals are, right? In other words, these narcissistic investments in certain types of grand narratives or certain types of stories, they ramify all the way down. They kind of mirror one another, right? And much in the same way as like being like, oh, I have an individual unconscious can make you feel uncomfortable. Talking about what's unknown or not knowable or hidden in the family can make a family uncomfortable. And talking about the family in ways that make the family seem a little bit uncomfortable, point to how the family can be kind of weird when you really think about it, can make an entire society super uncomfortable too. Right. so that discomfort ramifies and kind of mirror as above, below kind of thing. Right. So and here, maybe it's kind of helpful to this offers us an opportunity to tie things up kind of neatly by thinking about some of the work, clinically speaking, or like, in the theoretical clinical overlap, the concept of the uncanny is being put to, right? But kind of like one of the things we can say too, sort of by analogy here as well on our own part, right, is that just sort of prima facie, which is to say, like, without we take as, for the purposes of argumentation, let's just stipulate that people oftentimes like to think of, quote unquote, the family as being one stable thing that has always existed in one particular way. Right. Or is it that there is a quote unquote normal, right? Which is universal and essential, and from which everything distinctions that like flow from that or are made within that are abnormal. Right. And so the family, in the story is mom, dad, 2.5 kids, and a dog or a cat, and maybe both. Right. That's the norm.
Yeah, this isn't true. This is not a true story. Just to be clear, the family is historically contingent and continually changing.
Yeah, and for those people who are listening who are much more invested in Marx than they are in Freud or whatever, like you can go read some Engels on this. And
Yeah,
like,
sure.
like this family is the output of industrialization, right? Right. But like if you listen to people talking now, like again, this is not an abstract thing. People have a really intense vision of when they're talking about the family.
Yes.
Or like who is threatening the family, or talking about how the family in its current incarnation reflects certain, the outsourcing, say, of certain economic or social problems to individuals and not to political, collective determination. People punish you for saying that, right? Or punish you for saying, well, if you want to abolish the family as a concept, you must want to actually do like Cultural Revolution stuff and take kids from their parents, or do like, horrible kind of like taking indigenous children from their parents, or like that, which is not the same thing, right? Yeah. The point here is that,
I mean, one of the things that you're saying, and essentially, is that the family is one of the most overdetermined sites of meaning that we have.
Yeah, exactly, right. Exactly. And so like a concept that's kind of helpful, or just I think about, like, we have mythologies of the family, right? We have visions of what the family should be that kind of bleed into visions of what the family must be and can only ever be and has always been, right? And sometimes people will be talking about what they'll seem to be being descriptive, but they're actually being normative, right? And how, we got Mother's Day coming up, right? Talk about a vicious kind of like this. Obviously, we love all the mothers out there, happy Mother's Day, everybody. But also, like, there is a talk about something like we have mythologies about what mothers are supposed to be, what mothers are supposed to feel, right? How they're very, very special, and they're supposed to sacrifice all this stuff, and we give them one day a year to say thank you. And I know a lot of mothers who'll be like, well, that actually really sucks, and I would like much more than one day, and maybe how about you give me like maternity leave, it's decent, like there are all these things, but like that's a narrative that we have. It's a specialness, There's a narrative of specialness, which doesn't necessarily map onto the reality for many people, right? And we could also say is not the whole thing that's going on there, right? Talking about like mothers and emotional labor, right? Or mothers and social reproduction, that could be threatening to people who are like, well, the mothers just do what they do out of a necessary maternal love, and the mother's love is the purest thing, and all this other sort of like these bromides that we offer, right?
Ugh.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No. Like,
that's an involuntary noise.
So we collectively have investments in these things. I'm using the we kind of loosely here, right?
Loosely. Yeah, I get that. Yeah.
But like think about like the stories families tell and pass down through generations. Right? Or hell, let's even just say something really basic, right? Let's go back to Descartes for a second, right? The Cartesian cogito, it doesn't have parents, right? It doesn't come from a family. It doesn't have, it's not dogged by parental expectations or a desire to like, yeah, it's a thing. It's a discrete thing. It's not penetrated by others.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, I think we can all sort of say that, like, and this is, I think, a very basic thing. It's one of the things that's both very obvious, but also kind of difficult to name. We're not brains in vats. We're not Cartesian cogitos. There's a kind of weird fact, like, and our bodies we literally come from somebody else's body. Or at least, so, until we find a way around that, if that's where we want to go with things. But we are literally come out, our individual solidity and boundaries emerges from a really bloody moment, right, of exiting someone else's body, right? We aren't born fully rational, and it's not like you flip a switch and you suddenly become rational. Rationality, to the extent that we achieve it, is a temporary state.
Yeah.
Right. Or it's something that we have, in our best moments, or supposedly in our most like accountable ones, whatever.
Right? A thin veneer.
The thin veneer. Yeah. But two, like, I think the thing we can kind of think about is like how families, and I think this is, it can be painful to talk about this for a lot of people, right? And, and people even maybe to listen to, but like families have stories that they tell about where they came from and what's normal in that family. Right. And those are stories that aren't necessarily always true, right? And that oftentimes are more aspirational than they are descriptive, or more normative than they are descriptive. Right?
Or they enshrine something that is important to be told and retold, but is not like true in a particular sort of, or it encodes like an important disavowal or something along those lines.
Yeah, like your mother isn't just like another person, right? The mother is the center of the family, right? The story of when mom and dad met is really, really important. Here, that's the story it truly is.
The family romance.
Yeah, well, yeah, the family romance being specifically the idea too that like well, your origins are secret and you are special, right? Mm-hmm. The fantasy romance is a term that Freud gives to name the very frequent thing. It's one of those things too. Once you see it everywhere. The stories that lots of kids grow up thinking that they have a secret, special, hidden family, that they have a hidden destiny. That I don't know. You're maybe growing up on Tatooine, the son of a pair of the adopted child of a bunch of moisture farmers, but you're secretly, your dad was a war hero in the Clone Wars, or you're being raised by Muggles, but actually you're special and there's someone else who are your parents, right? We have this kind of investment in these stories. Right? Think about the way family stories are told over and over and over again.
Yeah, there's a sort of incantatory or ritual character often, and they're often told, I'm thinking, they're told at funerals, they're told at weddings, they're told at, miscellaneous family gatherings. And part of the role of growing, as the generations shift, oftentimes people expect you to take up and retell those stories. And
I think this that bears back to our talk last episode about the punishments, the way we punish people or the way people, even rationally speaking, will invoke supposedly reasonable reasons for why you can't talk ill of the dead.
Yeah, right? I was just thinking that this is a way in which to go back to the uncanny, that this is something, these family stories they're spectral, right? Families are all haunted by their own stories in some sort of ways.
And think about and this does happen sometimes. Think about the feeling where it's I don't know, you find an old family album, right? And you're paging through it. But this is a thing that I'm trying to, I can't bring in specific material that I've heard in case conferences or stuff, but or people, I don't want to betray the confidences of friends, but I think a lot of people can share the experiences or notes. Say you're going through a family album and you see a picture of someone in there and you've never heard of this person, right? But they look a lot like your mother and they're in this family photo and you're like, oh, who's that? And it's we don't talk about that uncle, that part of the family. Or you see a picture of a family and there's a baby in it and you're like, whose baby is that? Looks a lot like me. Maybe it's an uncanny double, and it turns out, well, actually, they died. That really does happen.
Yeah.
Right? People, there's this phenomenon sometimes called the replacement child, even where someone will find out. And note here, this is the thing. It's not like you find out and it totally rocks their world. It's often more like a piece falling into place.
Yeah.
Right? Where it's a person will be I don't feel quite real, or I feel like I don't. Even when I'm feeling successful, I'm getting parental approval. It feels like my parents are sad somehow, or feel like I'm constantly trying to prove something to people, but I don't know who I myself am. And then you're going through an old family album, and you see a picture of, or you find a card or something noting a parental, a child that died young. And it turns out, oh shit, the kid had the same name as I did, and they never told me about it. That actually happens, right? And these are moments; these are uncanny moments. Where we're suddenly oh, is that me? Is it not me? Did I think is everything I knew about my family a lie? Right. And maybe you call it a lie, but maybe it's also something else. Maybe it's a story that we're invested in that has shaped certain expectations, but also has repressed or set aside certain truths. And part of what's so brutal about the family, and part of why I think the haunting is a really helpful metaphor, is that it comes back, right? There is a way in which the repressed aspects or the things that are hidden in the family kind of haunt it unless they're worked through and talked about. And so it's, there's a bunch of French psychoanalysts who have said this. There's, you can put this on Octave Manoni or François Dolto, but there's this phrase sometimes comes up in some sort of Lacanian psychoanalytic French theory about family, which is that the child is the symptom of the parents, right?
The first time I heard that, it just rocked me over like physically. Yeah.
It's a fucking amazing, the child is the symptom of the parents. And obviously, on the one hand, yes, the child is a symptom of the parents in the way in which, I don't know, like a fever is a symptom of the cold, right? You have to have these people who are parents and there has to be some insemination and parturition in order for the child to exist, right? Right. The parents are the necessary biological condition for
preconditions.
They're the site, they're the conditions of possibility, right? But also the idea here, this idea of a symptom. Symptoms are meaningful. We'll be talking about this a lot. We'll continue talking about this, right? But the idea is that the child doesn't just express the fact that that these two parents one time fucked, right? The idea here, sorry, it's crude, but it's true. The idea is the child also can express in their experience of the world, in things that the child may not even be able to name, things that are not spoken about or things that are present in the parental relationship that the parents are not necessarily explicitly communicating to them.
And this might not be equally distributed among children in a family also, right? It might be carried more specifically or more intensely by one child, for instance.
Yeah, like if you're that replacement child and then you have a younger sibling, that younger sibling isn't going to have the same experience of parental expectations. They're going to have a different name. Right there, but the kind of the through line in this is the way in which like that thing that's not spoken nonetheless expresses itself, right? Like much in the ways is in which the unconscious kind of bubbles up in these examples of the uncanny, right? But the two sides of this too, like, are one, it expresses itself kind of inevitably, right? And in fact, I will give a lovely line from a pair of Hungarian French psychoanalysts, which is just, I think, quite lovely. And I'd like to read, which is on this sort of, it's Abraham and Torok for people who are going to follow or curious about this. But I'm going to, if I could just read a line, if that's
Please.
all right. Yeah, my voice is nowhere near as good as, but yeah, Abraham and Torok, what they do is they go to this idea of the uncanny and they take it as the uncanny as being something that happens within the system of family or within the family as a kind of like matrix where there's a thing that haunts the family, right? And they call it a specter or a phantom, right? That is, and this, you may recall from last week, we talked about like the secrets or what's hidden. And one way to understand the uncanny is like the thing that was supposed to be secret comes up anyways.
Yeah.
Right? Is you're confronted with the hidden thing. The phantom is also a metapsychological fact. That is, it is not the dead that haunt us, but the gaps left in us by the secrets of others. Although the phantom is not associated with the loss of an object, it could be the result of a failed process of mourning. The phantom of popular belief, that's the ghost is unfinished business, the phantom, the revenant who hides out in a place, whatever, objectivizes a metaphor that operates in unconscious, the burial in the object of an inadmissible fact. I want to reiterate that last line because I think it's really lovely. The burial in the object of an inadmissible fact. And think about this. We can talk about, I'll tell two quick example and then a quick story from some other clinical work, right? One, you alluded to the example of what comes up at funerals.
Yeah.
Right. And this gets to the point too, that this sort of thing I really think we should think about is the way in which our individual, collective on the level of the family, but also collective on the level of society, investment in certain stories, grand narratives, right? Reasons, justifications, whatever, is active, ongoing, and policed in the realm of like what we might call taboos or social norms. Think about like you're at a funeral and everyone is getting together to basically tell stories about the person who died. And then someone says something which, well, a lot of people would not like to hear, right? Or someone says something which is true, but people would wish would be buried with the dead person. Someone who's like, well, yeah, grandpa was really, really, they'll oftentimes have these metaphors where people are like, well, he really spoke his mind. Or he was never afraid of telling the truth and suffering fools. You're like, okay, so he was really racist and dressed down a couple of waiters, right? Or like, yeah, he was viciously abusive and telling people about what he perceived as their failing. But imagine someone who's like, well, yeah, I there was that one time he got that statutory charge, or like, I wouldn't let my kids be in the same room as him. Like, you're not supposed to say that, right? That's a thing that's supposed to die with them. And the person who says that, well, it's like, why are you making this about you? Or that's a horrible, untrue thing to say. Or like, how dare you, right? They punish you for saying that. But what if like you need to work through that? You need to mourn it, right? So again, this is where I think the rubber hits the road in terms of like social sanction. And by the way, like imagine putting yourself in that position where if like you know something about someone that no one else does and everyone's getting together to celebrate that person, or at least you know it in a way that's really present to you because it was a trauma and you saw it, you experienced it. Maybe it happened to you directly or you know it happened. Everyone else is saying that didn't happen that way. And they're asking you to ongoingly buy in. This is why anniversaries of a person's death can be really painful, right? We're all going to get together and talk about how great they were. But well, you're actually like, well, I remember the time he said that one horrible thing to me and I'll never forget it. Right. And everyone else will we use like words like gaslighting here, but I think we can, those are a little more contemporary in some ways, but like we could think about the broader investment in fantasy is a kind of collective gaslighting, right? Or like a story that we want to tell. We'd rather tell a story and it's not working, right? So think about that's the first example.
I don't know, but you're reminding me of that line from Sarah Ahmed, which I think is so important. And, she's talking about this in the context of institutions, but obviously the family is very much an institution. That idea that the person who points out the problem themselves becomes the problem, right? At least in the eyes of the institution, which is certainly the case in this instance with the family, right?
Yeah. And here,
the person who doesn't let the dead rest with their secret.
Yeah, you might. It's like suddenly they'll blame you as though you just killed the dead person,
right?
Like they would be. And of course, like again, the point here is like much like your suffering at the hands of that person is not going to go away. Like the reality of what they did isn't going to go away, even if people lie about it. And in fact, that reality may insist even more. But here, the one quick story I'll tell, right? And this is from the work of another French analyst, Yvonne Godelier. It's in their book History Beyond Trauma, I believe, but it also comes up in a bunch of her stories, right? The story is, again, it's a family in Paris, and I think it's like the 60s or 70s. They have a son who is in his early teens and nonverbal, right? Doesn't talk. But he does have a series of behaviors where he acts out. And specifically, he destroys art objects in their home. He picks up vases, throws them on the ground. In the middle of a meal, he'll just destroy stuff. And one of the two analysts, I forget if it's Stefano Godelier, goes to is called in to like quote unquote fix the child. The parents want this child to talk. They want to deal with the fact that he's breaking things, and they want to like correct stuff. Right? Mm-hmm. And the analyst in question tries mightily to get the kid to talk or to figure out what's going on, and they can't seem to do it. But one day, after several weeks of analysis, they had this thought, which is that, well, this is France in the 1960s, and it's kind of weird that there's all this really great art in this house, the art that the kid is destroying. And so they asked the parents just randomly, what's the deal with this art? The vases that he's breaking in the middle of meals, where does it come from? Like, well, and of course, some of you may already detected where this is going. The parents are like, you're done with our kid now. Get the fuck out. And to fill in the gaps, this is all art that was looted by the Vichy regime from Jewish families, right? But I want us to sit with this for 1 second, right? Because who knows what's going on inside that kid's head, right? Or what their developmental or other cognitive issues are, right? But their behavior is literally in the middle of these nice meals, in this nice house with all these nice things. They're breaking this stuff. They're symptomatically expressing what the family will not admit. The child is the symptom of the parents, and that behavior, which seems uncanny and upsets the taboos and silences the family, actually references something that the family refuses to talk about, but which comes up nonetheless. We'll talk more about this and unpack some of the threads of that down the line, right? Especially as a bearing questions of intergenerational trauma. But the idea here, again, the family is a contingent thing that produces certain stories, and we buck up against it. In any event, and that can feel uncanny, it can feel wrong, but hey, we're going to lean into it. Look,
so
on that note,
that's all from us for this week. We'll be back next week. Thank you, as always, for listening. Bye.
Bye.
This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.